Welcome to Painting with Carmia. This is a painting I did about 5 months ago by now. The previous painting I uploaded, I hope that I'm remembering that correctly, titled A Spring Day, features the same characters, and I did that on smoother paper than this. I liked overall a lot of how the painting worked, but one thing I was very dissatisfied with was how the background came out on smoother paper. The disadvantage of using smoother watercolor paper is essentially that a lot of techniques like wet on wet don't work as well with it. On the other hand, I think that it is easier as a beginner to do sharper details on things like your characters with hot press or just smoother paper in general. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and I was not happy with that. And so I decided at that point, how the background came out, so I decided at that point to switch to a cold press paper, which was quite rough. This is the Bao Hong watercolor paper, the cold press, and it's sort of a medium texture. It's not too rough, but it has a decent texture to hold the paint, and you will see later as I work on the background how much better that turned out for me as a result. Right now I'm just working on the skin, and that doesn't look terribly different between hot press and cold press, I would argue, but as we continue with the painting, I do think that the difference in the paper will start showing up more. Wet on wet techniques work much better on cold press paper. So there we are. You can see that I am starting to wet all of these stones and then slowly adding paint in different sort of configurations in order to get a lot of very natural effects, which would be very hard to achieve with hot press paper. You would just get a lot of streak lines because it has a smooth texture. The paint will just dry and create streak lines when you're trying to get these types of effects, but because the cold press paper has the texture, it sort of starts absorbing it more and the paint flows in very different ways, and it is a much more effective technique for creating backgrounds and more natural sort of areas like that. So the general idea would be to wet the area you want to paint only and then start laying down paint bit by bit to get the different effects. Now I'm wetting the sky to do the same thing. I did not do the character skin tones with wet on wet because trying to get details on the shadows and things like that with wet on wet techniques would not be feasible. And another thing I wound up doing, which you'll see once I'm done with the blue sky, I'm narrating this afterwards. I wound up not having any usable audio when I was actually painting, so just narrate afterwards. That's probably easier anyway, rather than thinking about what to say while painting. I also wound up adding some very loose impressions of greenery into the already wet blue sky. It's meant to be very vague and indistinct. It's just meant to give the impression that there is greenery in the background, not any specific, really sharp, detailed greenery, which you could identify as anything. It's meant to sort of emulate the blur that the camera might give you, for example. That's kind of the feeling I'm going for, to create the sense that the characters are the most important in the foreground and they're sharpest, and then as you go backwards, a lot of details are softer and less important. However, since the characters have black hair, I'm going to be painting that very near the end, because if I tried to paint the black hair first and then the blue sky, for example, then any areas where the water from the blue sky touches black hair, then that paint can start moving into the sky and make a mess. So that's why you do light to dark with watercolor. Whereas with a lot of other mediums which are more solid, you would do the lights first and then add the shadow. You would do the darks first and then add highlights on top. Watercolor isn't like that. Now, this technique here is based on something I saw in a lot of very old Chinese paintings and like prints and things like that, which were would be included in books. To be frank, a lot of them were erotic art. But anyway, I didn't do a very good job of it here. It's something I'd need to practice more. But in order to create the effect of the tree having those needles, the artist would create this little star shape in ink with in black ink, and then paint around it in sort of like a ball and let it fade out a little bit, and that would create the impression of the needles on the tree with relatively little effort. I think that it's a great technique. I just didn't do it super well in this painting. It's fine, but it's definitely not as good as the samples I was working off of, but that's why you need to practice. I would say that this was 5 months ago, and I'm already much better at painting on cold press paper, and in particular at getting fine details, as you'll see later with the characters' hair and things like that. I've become better at that. I think my newer painting, A Ghost Meets His Wife, or something like that is what I titled it, that has much more fine details on the characters and their hair, and it's still on exactly the same cold press paper as this painting. So it's something which definitely just takes time. Alright, I'm just going to stop babbling at you for now and let you listen to the music and watch the painting happen in front of your eyes at, I think 500 times speed is what I had to get it down to. Alright, so this is when I'm starting on the hair, and everything else around it is dry, so I can start adding black details without risking its smearing and later on when I add other details. So we have the guqin. I apologize if my pronunciation isn't quite right. I have an accent, but there is the instrument, and that's also going to be a black lacquered wood, and we have the hair. The first thing was to do a very, very light layer for the hair, a barely very grey layer with white highlights left in. Not sure how well I did on this painting with leaving in the white highlights, but that's the general theory when it comes to doing watercolor and manga hair. You'll notice if you look at manga illustrations by famous manga artists like Takeuchi Naoko and Clamp, that you will see a lot of highlights left in the hair, and it's just white space. Basically, because it's, these are wet medium, these are water-based mediums. Manga artists don't all use watercolor, some of them use poster color, and I know that Copics are popular now too, but the general idea is these are not mediums where you can add an opaque layer on top of something. If you want white, you need to basically leave the white of the paper underneath, like with watercolor, and so what you need to do is leave these white areas where you've never painted, and those become the highlights in the hair. Obviously in real life people don't have white highlights in their hair unless they actually have white in their hair, but that's just how it's done in manga to convey the appearance of these highlights and to create sharp contrast so that the character's hair doesn't wind up just being a big solid block of color. And that's something that I always have to work on very carefully and slowly layer the hair to have individual strands. I've got better at that than when I did this painting, but this painting was still a good first step at attempting the method using cold press paper. I found that I still struggled a little bit with getting these sharper details on the hair strands, and for later paintings I've switched to using the tiniest paintbrush I can find and very slowly building up very little strands of hair, etc. But here I was not quite as good at that. Still, overall I was happy with how this painting came out, otherwise I wouldn't be doing a review of it. But definitely those are areas where I've improved since then. I learned a lot by doing this painting, but I was overall pretty happy with the results. I quite like how it came out. And I just, basically when I paint, I just have the camera above me on a tripod and I just hit the record button. I just make sure the lighting is half decent, as good as I can get it anyway. It's not a real studio setup recording. And the lighting as good as I can, and I make sure hopefully make sure the camera is locked in its current focus so it doesn't try to zoom in on my hand, and then I just hit record. So it's a very casual painting and it just keeps jumping to the next time I paint when I do a layer, wait for it to dry, do a layer, wait for it to dry, etc. Sometimes these paintings are done over the course of a week. Sometimes if I'm not feeling well or if I'm busy, even 2 weeks or more, but usually a week. So it's so funny to look back at these and go, oh yes, actually, I did that over all of this time, but now it's like a 17-minute video. There's the tiny brush. I was trying to get those sharp details. I just will say I don't think I did as well as on more recent paintings, but it's a process. And oh yes, one thing is I mixed up the characters' hairs with black, but I had a base color which was different between the two of them, so that they would look slightly different. The character to the right in the blue Hanfu has a very dark blue base and then black over that, so that his hair has a very slight cooler tone to it, whereas the character to the left behind him has brown in the base for his hair, so it has a slightly warmer tone to it. So I wanted that to sort of convey something about their character. Since everyone just has black hair in a lot of my stories, I do want to just add little details like that, which give some sense that they're not all identical shades of hair, because people have different shades to their hair, even if they're broadly in the same, color range. So I wanted to convey some of that feeling and give a bit of variety to the way I do the characters. And I think I did at this point still try to use a little bit of a marker that's a Japanese brush marker, which is used for doing like imitation, for doing brush painting, but without, dipping ink and all of that. And there's a fine tip on them for doing really small calligraphy, and I did use that to add a few darker areas to the hair. I don't really do that anymore, but I did at the time do this because it is a technique I use when I do black and white manga style illustrations, and I wanted to see how it would work in painting. I'd say it can work, but I've definitely kind of shifted away from doing that. Okay, this is something that I have been experimenting with still, is actually using certain gel pens to create embroidery details on characters' clothing, because it can be hard to, with a paintbrush, a very tiny paintbrush, use watercolor to actually get those types of sharper details for embroidery, and sometimes it can work to use gel pens to get certain effects, especially the white gel pen, if it's on the right base color, can create some nice effects. It's something which I'm starting to do in conjunction with the brush as well, and so certain bits will be gel pen, certain bits will be brushed on my hand with the paintbrush. But at the moment with this painting, I still just use the gel pen, and it's just meant to create some very subtle feeling of embroidery, which is not meant to be something that immediately catches your eye. It's just meant to give some extra texture to their clothing, rather than being really detailed and intricate embroidery. And it's still something that's a bit of a work in progress, but I do like the effect. Something I basically learned I learned a lot about painting, honestly, by just looking at the notes that manga artists would give on their paintings. You can buy art books, illustration collections from manga artists a lot of the time, and they'll have notes they've left on what they used in the painting and what the painting process was like. I know the Sailor Moon ones have been fan translated because the art books have never had an English release, but there are fan translations of them, which are probably still floating around on the internet, and you can see things like what mediums she used and things like that. And I learned a lot from that, and one thing I learned was basically an approach to painting where your focus is on getting the result you want and like. The focus is not on I'm doing a watercolor painting with only watercolor. It's basically I just want a painting of these characters from my story, and I want to make it look nice, and whatever medium will help me with that, I will poke around with. If they're at all compatible, I can combine mediums. So that's kind of the approach that I have. If a gel pen will get me the result I want, if it's useful, then why not use it, right? And I think at this point, the painting's nearly done. I'm just buffing out certain areas where I didn't like how it dried. I just get a little older scrubby brush and I just kind of get it damp and buff those areas. But that is the painting. Wow. So there we are. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you join me again next time for another painting video.